My 240SX doesn't have a trunk floor or a rear seat, so in this episode I'm going to be building one that's functional, sturdy, and just a little bit over the top. The first thing I had to do was take some measurements to determine what the overall dimensions of the trunk floor are going to be. To do this, I laid a meter stick down the center line of the trunk floor, and then at certain increments I measured horizontally to figure out what the width was, and then I recorded that so I could draw out kind of a map of what the shape would look like. In addition to measuring widths, there was also some parts where I had to measure heights so I can create a vertical profile of how it's going to need to slope downwards to meet the floor. Once I had finished all my measurements, I ended up with this diagram, which I understand looks like the ravings of a lunatic crackhead, but I assure you there is some logic here and I can understand what it's trying to say. I then took these measurements and used them to create a 3D model of what the trunk floor would look like. Ultimately, this step is more or less completely unnecessary. There's no real reason you'd have to do this unless you're like me and you just really like using SketchUp. This really helped me visualize what the final product was going to look like, although this design does end up changing before we're finished. I then switched from computer-aided design to cardboard-aided design and whipped up a few templates for what the actual pieces were going to need to look like. This allowed me to fine-tune my measurements, which were initially a little rough, and also decide if this design was going to work in practice.
So I think I'm actually going to change up my approach here. In my original idea, this piece here that covers where the seat used to be kind of slopes down from the back to the floor. But then I realized that it's kind of stupid to have this piece slope forward because that's just going to cause anything that I put in the back of the car to roll forward into the front of the car. So I thought it would be better to lift this so that it's level with the trunk, and then I'm effectively just extending the trunk area out into the back seat. And then I can have a hard cutoff there to go behind the seat. And I think that'll be a lot better. It'll require a bit of revision to my templates, but ultimately it's roughly the same design, just with less angles to deal with.
So with that new design in mind, I modified my template to get rid of that slanted part, and I was a lot happier with how it turned out. This makes it more like kind of like a RX-7, where it's just all cargo platform behind the front seats, and I think it's going to be a lot more functional. The one downside of this design is that you can't recline the seat quite as far back, but that's really not an issue for me, so I'm not going to worry about it. At this point I was confident enough to make the jump from cardboard to plywood, so I traced all the templates out onto some 1/2-inch sanded and cut them out with my jigsaw. Once that was done, I laid all the pieces out inside of the car to make sure they fit, and they fit like a glove, which actually ended up screwing me over just a little bit down the line. Now I had to figure out how I was going to connect these two pieces together since they connected at an angle. So I downloaded an angle finder app on my phone, and I determined that the angle between these two pieces is about 60 degrees. I then ripped a 60-degree angle into this 2x4 so that I can use it as a cross brace, and then I screwed both of the pieces into that cross brace.
So here's my logic behind making this 3 separate pieces. For one, if this was all one piece, it would be too big to fit in the car. And for 2, the spare tire is going to go right under here. So I wanted to have the ability to remove this piece and get at my spare tire.
Although this is going to be 3 separate pieces, for the time being I use some MDF scraps to join everything together into one big piece.
Now, you might be wondering what the point was of me just screwing all these pieces back together. And that's just a temporary measure. That's so that I can upholster it all as one piece. And the reason I need to upholster it all as one piece is because the rug I've chosen has an incredibly sick design that I want to preserve. So the plan is I'm going to attach this carpet like I would any other upholstery, and then I'm going to cut everything back apart. And then when I put it back in the car, this design should line up more or less the way it's supposed to. It's got llamas on it. How cool is that?
So I laid the workpiece down on the rug, and then I did a bunch of measurements to make sure that the rug would be completely symmetrical on top of the wood. Once everything was lined up, I employed my usual upholstery strategy of stapling like a deranged person with no real strategy. I also quickly realized that these temporary slats were going to be in the way of where my staples needed to be, so I had to move those inboard a little bit. I'm not an expert upholsterer by any means. I think I barely qualify as an amateur, but I did find that rug is really not an easy material to work with. Once I had the core stapling done, I took a look from the other side, and I was super happy with how this turned out. I feel so vindicated in my decision to use this ridiculous llama rug. You can see here how this border runs perfectly around the edge of the wood, and how this design is going to run straight down the middle of the car. I wasn't done yet though, as I still had to trim off all this excess material, which ate through a ton of knife blades and was probably harder work than the actual stapling itself. But in due time, this is what I ended up with. I then removed my improvised joinery, and with a very sharp knife, cut straight down the seam in between the wood to separate the carpet.
Okay, so this is where I might be screwed. Since I wrapped carpet around each piece of wood, they've expanded, give or take a ½ inch on each side. And I did try to account for this with my template, but I'm not sure I accounted for it enough. So there's a possibility I'm going to try to install this stuff in the car, and it's just going to be too big to fit where it needs to be. And if that's the case, I'm going to have to pull the carpet off, trim down the wood, and then re-staple the carpet, which I really don't feel like doing. Shit. Yeah, I fucked up.
So yeah, as I alluded to before, the pieces originally fit too well, and I hadn't left the tolerances there to wrap carpet around them. Luckily, that front panel still fit like a glove, however these two back panels had grown too much and they couldn't both fit in the trunk. To fix this, I had to peel off the carpet that I had just installed, and then trim about 1/4 inch to 1/2 inch off of the outside edge of both pieces. Once I had done that, everything fit just fine. And then for approximately the billionth time, I had to take all these pieces back out of the car. This time it was to finish up the upholstery work. Basically, now that I knew the carpet wouldn't need to come off again, I could go through and put a shitload more staples in so that it wouldn't come off by accident. Now I had to do something about the edges of the carpet that don't wrap around the wood. I didn't want these lifting up from regular wear and tear, and I also didn't want to put staples on the top side. I ended up putting extra strength construction adhesive underneath these edges, which should hold them down until long after I've wrapped this car around a tree. I'm not sure if it's necessary to clamp down construction adhesive, but I decided to do it anyways for safety. On a side note, if you don't own an anvil, you should buy one, because they're awesome, and I literally use mine for everything. This video is brought to you by anvils. Once everything was clamped up, I let it sit for 24 hours and got the very familiar feeling that my neighbors think I'm a crazy person. While I waited for all that stuff to dry, I decided to give the rear interior a nice vacuuming, because once this trunk floor is installed, it's going to be very difficult to get underneath it. You can see here that there are wires going underneath the floor. I designed it so that it would sit up 1 inch from the floor, allowing things to run underneath. So now what I need to do is add 1-inch spacers to make that a reality. I pilfered from my supply of old 1x2s and MDF scraps and added some supports to the bottom of each piece. It's kind of a tight fit to get everything in there, but that's a good thing because it means the thing's not going to be moving around while I drive. It's basically a press fit. At this point, I could have conceivably called the project done, but there was one more finishing touch I wanted to add. I wanted the ability to fasten all these pieces together, and to do that, I bought these little chest clasps from Home Depot, and that's going to allow me to fasten everything together, but when I need to, I can unclip them and remove the spare tire. I figured 2 clasps on each edge was plenty secure enough for my application. And overall they work good enough. It's kind of clear that they weren't designed to work in right angles to each other, and if this was something I had to access all the time, I might change them out for something that works differently, but for this application, I don't have a problem with them. And at this point, the only thing that was left to do was reinstall the rest of the interior so I could admire how it looked. And that's the whole thing done, and I'm really happy with how it turned out. Overall, it's very sturdy. I think it personally looks awesome, even though I understand some people might not like the stupidly ornate carpet I picked out. If you wanted to do this yourself, there's no reason you couldn't just use black carpet, except for the fact that it would make you boring. In terms of price, this really wasn't an expensive project. All I had to buy was a half-inch sheet of plywood, which was kind of expensive, a rug that I bought secondhand off Facebook Marketplace, and the chest hardware, which was cheap. So overall, I'm into this, less than $150, almost all of which was the cost of plywood. The weight gain for the car is pretty minimal. It's only about probably 20 or 30 pounds, which for a street car, I'm really not too concerned about. If you'd like to see more of this car, I've got a ton of videos on it. It's a never-ending project. Right now I'm in the middle of a full chassis swap on it, and I'll leave a link to that playlist in the description down below. If you like this video, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe. And if you didn't like this video, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe. And I will see you next time.